Good morning, everyone. This is session 3. So just to make sure that you've got the right session, this is session 3 with Stuart. My name's Nathan. How is everybody this morning? Going very well, I hope. I'm going to quickly take you through what we're going to cover off this morning. And then, as Stuart mentioned in his presentation this morning, he's going to run through a more detailed presentation on this key question: how should Powerlink consider new technology in its demand and energy forecasting methodology? So presenter is Stuart, and as I mentioned, my name's Nathan. I'm going to be your facilitator this morning. So this morning's going to run a little bit like this. Stuart's going to present for around about 30 minutes. We're then going to do something called a World Cafe, which, don't worry, I will explain to you later for those who haven't seen it before. It's not as scary as it sounds, and unfortunately it doesn't include food. That's what we're going to do this morning, and then we're going to have a little bit of a wrap-up and Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to go back into that main room. So that's what we're going to cover off this morning. All good? So you get a chance to, as Jared mentioned earlier, get a chance to pen your thoughts and share your ideas. This is really the session where you get to think about and apply some of your thoughts and feelings as to what you've heard so far this morning. I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who's going to present in a little bit more detail.
Excellent, thank you, Nathan. So, as I mentioned earlier on, so into a little bit more detail on the demand and energy forecast, and then so the first half is really about, the structure of the model, how it's all pulled together, some of the regressions that we've done, take you through the methodology behind it, and the second half of the presentation is really then what assumptions did we then put in for this emerging new technologies, and then that's the subject of the further discussion, as I said later on. They said there was 3 main components to the demand energy forecasting model. One is the, make sure I've got the right, is that the pointer? Here you go, yep. So one component is the distribution customers, the direct connect customers, and then the adjustments we've made for new technologies. So you can see there is that ramp up in the LNG. The majority of that there is really Boyne Island. This is looking at energy there. And I think that DNSP, the actual DNSP one is actually going up. I think that's DNSP minus the new technology. So if we didn't have the emerging technology offset, then you'd actually see the distribution would actually be increasing. The large customer component, that's the relative simple part of the modelling. Go to the direct connect customers, or the ones who have committed to connect, and get that 10-year forecast from them, both from demand and energy, and you can pop that directly into the model. So they do that on an annual basis. So that's the relatively simple part. The DNSP component, that's when it starts to get a little bit more tricky. That's when we're looking at the regressions, say that gross state product, population growth, air conditioning penetration, electricity price. Take all of those factors into account to forecast forward what electricity and demand and energy will be. We use historic energy and demand, so we go back to the year 2000. So we use the last 15 years of history. From a weather perspective, we go back for weather correction. We use data even further back to make sure we've got a correct average day or average season. And when we're doing the regression, we want to make sure we've got the whole underlying distribution. So we actually then have to look at, in the history, look at the solar penetration we've had, and actually then add back in that energy and demand component into that before we start doing the regression. So we actually feed the solar energy and the solar demand back into the history, do the regression, and then use the forecast of that going forward and take that back out again. So that's in the weather conditions again, we normalize the history back to a 50% POE day, and we use that as the average. And then we also then, as we see later on, we then use the more extreme days to work out a 10% and a 90% POE energy and demand, or demand, sorry. Energy regression. So we get data from IEMO. They provide data on economic variables, on price. So we gather that from IEMO and Deloitte's Access Economics. We then combine those economic variables in a whole raft of different ways, and we also then look at delays in time as well. So sometimes you'll see a year delay before, say, a price increase will actually make a market impact on your demand or energy. So we've looked at delaying some of these economic variables by a year as well. So in total, we looked at 204 regressions and then looked at the top 25. And here are the top 25 here. So basically saying, well, this is the DNSP component in gigawatt hours and the statistical fit of those top 25 regressions. So 1 being perfect fit, 0 being not very good at all. Now, that fit is using your standard statistical fit type measures. I think it's R-squared, Durbin-Watson, and there's a few others that we've also looked at as well. So we've looked at a range of them to say, well, yep, how good is that regression? And when we've looked at the 25, we've basically picked one pretty in the center, as in from a gigawatt hours perspective. So you're saying it's around about 42,000 gigawatt hours from the DNSP perspective. That's in 2025. But there is, you can see there, some other regressions which are equally statistically sound. You can say, well, it could be 44 or it could be 40. But we weren't saying, we didn't back, oh yes, well, it's going to be lower, and we didn't say, no, it's going to be higher. We just said, well, let's take a relatively central one, and also one which is a kind of a very broad one. So we went for Queensland gross state product as an example, because that's a very broad economic indicator, rather than going for maybe perhaps a more bespoke economic one, which might have said, oh yeah, it gives you out here, but you say, well, hang on, what in reality, how much credence can you put on that particular economic value? So we went for, the case here we used GSP and also total electricity price delayed by 1 year. So that gives us the middle, and then we run through the high and low economic predictions through the regression. That gives you your high and low energy bounds. As I mentioned earlier, we're actually seeing a change in peak demand. So that's from 5 years ago. You can see the afternoon maximum demand before we had solar PV. 1,300 megawatts of solar PV later. That demand in that period there has disappeared. And we've had a peak at 17:30, so 5:30 in the early evening. And what we'll see is over the next couple of years is that that's going to move even further out to around about 6:30, and by that point it's dark. So the solar PV contribution on maximum demand is then going to be diminished. But as I said earlier on, the energy will again continue to be taken off the grid. And as I say, this is the opportunity for us is once we start getting to that evening peak, is when storage comes along, can we move some of that evening peak back into the summer afternoon when we've got plenty of solar. So that's the opportunity for us going forward.
Still a little bump down, was that us switching?
Yeah. So there's a number of switching, and then I'm getting another bump but an hour later. So. On the demand side, so there's probably two main aspects of the demand part of the DNSP. There's the non-weather dependent and the weather dependent. So taking the non-weather dependent first. So this is the load which has been growing over time, which is not related to, I dare say, weather, or whether it be heating or cooling. Now, to get a view of that, we take the median maximum demand in September. So that's the shoulder period where there's not much heating and there's not much cooling. And we do the regression on that data for September. Again, the 200 and odd regressions, looking at the top 25. There you go, statistical fit. And there's the non-weather dependent megawatts. So we're looking in there at 5,400. But again, you can see there's plus or minus 200 megawatts. So there's still a little bit of, say, well, it's a forecast, it's 10 years out. But you could see that non-weather dependent part, it would be plus or minus a couple of hundred megawatts, depending on what regression you choose. So again, we've chosen one in the middle, and again, one where, again, it's relatively broad. So again, Queensland GSP is being a tried and tested, reliable economic measure.
So Stuart, what time of the day is that? Because that there'd still be a very strong daily cycle in the non-weather dependent demand. So how do you choose the time of day?
In that case, it's
as Stuart said, the non-weather dependent demand is determined as the median weekday in the month of September. The median maximum demand weekday in the month of September, and in September that is always evening for Queensland, so it's normally 6:30 p.m.
The weather dependent part. So obviously in the summer's the one most interesting. A lot of air conditioning pushes up our maximum demand for summer. And for that case, we do a regression based on population growth and aircon penetration. And if you look at that over time, you can see that that's what that regression predicts. And this is how you can see the weather-dependent demand has changed over the last 15 years. And it's been following this trend. And as you see, as the penetration of air conditioning saturates, then that's then starting to level off. So you combine all of them together. So you've got their non-weather dependent, your weather dependent from the NSP perspective. You can then use the high and low economic GSP numbers again to give you the high and low bounds. And we also then repeat with extreme weathers. So then we actually then change the regression demand based on what would be the demand on say the average day. That's we've normalized everything to that. And then what would the demand be then on a 10% POE day? And then it gives you a view on what the demand would be like on a very hot Queensland summer, or what would be on a very cold Queensland summer. So we end up with high and low economic forecasts, and also is it going to be an average hot day? Is it going to be extremely hot, or is it going to be less hot? And that's where you get all those different variations. As I mentioned, we talked about we gathered in March, because what we'd seen is that relying on this regression of GSP and other things to identify what will demand energy be like in the future, but then there's no storage taken into account in your history. There is some solar PV, but what about the additional solar PV? If there is more energy efficiency than what we've traditionally had in recent years in the future. So we identified that, looking backwards as a prediction for what the future will be wasn't actually going to work for us as well as it had in the past. It worked really well, 1960 through to 2009. Pretty good relationship between economic activity, population growth, and energy demand. But in 2009, all that changed. And I can anticipate that it's going to change even more going forward. So we had a whole number of people. I notice a few of you are in the crowd today, so thanks very much for helping us again. And so what was the outcomes? Say we've made it very explicit what those adjustments are, and in the end it was 600 megawatts of demand that we reduced because of things that we believe could happen going forward, which are not captured in the regression of the past. And it's an ongoing commitment. We're going to need your help, not just this year, but next year and the year after, in order for us to make better forecasts going forward. As I say, the complexity is increasing, There's a number of challenges and opportunities for the industry going forward, and we want to work with you guys to make our forecast as good as possible. These are the emerging technologies we were looking at: solar PV, storage, energy efficiency, Tariff Reform, and also electric vehicles. So in the next few slides, you say, well, what did we assume? So solar PV. Currently, we've got 1,300 megawatts installed. Or at the end of last year, it was 1,300 megawatts. Increasing rate around about 20 megawatts a month. And we expect that to continue. The mix will change. It'll change from more residential, more into the industrial. But at that 20 megawatts a month, you get to that 3,700 megawatts limit. But as I say, its impact is different on demand and energy. So in here, so this is what we've got. So we can see that the reduction in annual energy increases over time. I think the load factor, I think it's assumed 15% of the total PV capacity from an energy perspective. And we will see benefit over the next couple of years of more solar reducing the peak demand. So we do see that, but then after about a couple of years, we end up with an evening peak, and then you can throw as much solar as you want on the network, but it's actually not going to change that summer evening peak. So that's our assumption. Battery storage. I said battery storage has a great opportunity for the industry. Will allow us to smooth those peaks out and flatten the demand profile. Now, what we see is with battery storage is that we don't see it having a huge impact on energy. You see the round cycle between charging a battery and taking it back would be relatively efficient, so you're not going to lose much. And people are still going to use roughly the same amount of energy. Just the time they consume it from the grid will be different. So we say that, yeah, in broad terms, energy will have no impact, but then from a peak demand perspective, we see that to then ramp up over time. Probably not much in the next couple of years, but really is then starting to ramp up as the cost of storage drops down, and we'll probably follow a similar path to the solar PV and other new technology cost trends.
Sorry, I have a question. How does that then consider people charging their batteries with their own generation? So rather than taking it from the grid, if they're using solar and then charging batteries and then using that energy at a time when they would normally take from the grid, how will that not have an impact on their annual energy?
So that will be, say for the case of if they generate by solar PV, it'll be captured in the other data. Whereas this is really saying, our assumptions at this point here is saying that, well, 10% of people who have solar PV will have storage. And then the generation at time of peak will be about half that battery's capacity. So I think it was 10% of 3,700 is 370, and half of that is 185. So that gives you a feel for, and that will be exports out to the network, and hence a reduction, use themselves, which will actually then reduce the demand over the transmission network. So now, you can have a great debate then, is 185 enough? I think we looked at that number, and then the week later the Tesla announcement came out and you said, oh, hang on, we should make it more. And then you say, well, but how will actually people use batteries? Will they actually use it themselves or generate back to the grid at time of peak? Or will they store it like squirrels and use it later in the evening? We're not sure. And that's part of the discussion we'd like to have with you guys today. Energy efficiency. So some energy efficiency has already been captured. People in this room have been changing their halogen 12-volt bulbs for LEDs. There is at least one of you in the room has done that. Maybe more. So there is some energy efficiency which we've been doing over the last 5 years, and that accounts for some of the disconnect we've seen since 2009. But we've got, further opportunities. The appliances are getting more efficient. Building standards, again, are driving more efficiencies. As I mentioned, Energex and Ergon are doing some great work in this space, and we'll be piggybacking on the back of that and saying, well, how much additional energy efficiency is there going out in the future. And here's the assumption we've got. So you can see that we're assuming the energy efficiency will, take energy out of the network. It will also help at peak demand. The example I gave you there was like the air conditioning units. So if they're being replaced with more efficient ones, then obviously that's going to pull your maximum demand down a little bit.
You mentioned you cleaned your kind of regression data for PV and weather.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered cleaning it for energy efficiency as well? Or how do you otherwise capture the historical rate of improvement? How much of that will capture your new environment?
Yeah, and that's probably an enhancement we can do going forward, perhaps. If you can actually get a view of what that energy efficiency we've had in the last, you could actually then put that into your regression, take it forward, and then put it back in again. That'd be something that we say.
Just knowing from experience, it makes it hard to find exactly how much of new energy efficiency will already be captured in the regression and how much you
Yeah, no, it's my guys keep telling me it's hard. But yeah, it's a great something that we'll have to look at. So how do you accurately understand what energy efficiency you've had, and how do you then reverse that back out? Solar PV was, again, we were probably 4 years ago saying, well, how do you factor that in? We thought, oh, that's going to be really, really hard. All of a sudden you've got the Australian Solar Institute. We've then got live feeds from solar PV, and all of a sudden you're getting a feel for, oh yeah, this is what contribution we're getting. You go back in records and see what the solar installation rates over the years were, and then all of a sudden you can then start backing it out. So there could be ways that we're not aware of at the moment, which might help us. Tariff reform and demand side management. Again, it probably impacts how people and how much solar is installed, or storage, or energy efficiency. What are those drivers? Consumers, to some extent, will be driven by the tariff reform. And what does that look like? So if there's an incentive to reduce your energy consumption at time of peak, I've already got solar PV, why wouldn't I charge up my batteries and use that myself? So, but if there's not a price signal for minimising your demand at peak, then apart from having a nice storage battery in my garage I can show my friends, there might be a little benefit. So what we'll probably see is with tariff reform and demand side management is that it will impact on demand, as in it will lower demand, but it won't have a huge amount of impact on energy. A little bit, but what we'll probably see is that people will change their consumption patterns, not actually reduce it completely, but just their time of use. So we haven't put anything in there for reduction for energy, but we've started factoring reduction in demand. So at 10 megawatts, that's about 1.5% of the DNSP load. So it's not huge, so you might say, well, perhaps it's more. But then you could say, well, hang on, we've also got a reduction for storage, and we've got a reduction for energy efficiency, and there's some cross-linkages between there as well. So, and electric vehicles. Not a huge uptake of electric vehicles in Australia at the moment. I think the Netherlands, Norway are the leaders. Netherlands have got, say, 6% of all new cars bought in the Netherlands are electric. So if we got to the point of 6% of all new cars had been bought in Australia for the last 10 years, so that actually 6% of our fleet was electric. So it's not 6% of being bought, currently it's less than 1%, but if it got to 6%, and then that was reflected across the whole fleet, so there's a long way before you get to that space, then the impact on the state maximum demand is less than 2%. So every 1% of penetration is worth about 0.3% of energy at state level. So if you got to 6%, which is a big step forward where we are, you're going to increase it by 2%. Now, one would hope that we'll do it well and that it won't impact maximum demand, and we will charge them at off-peak, whenever the peak is. But from an energy perspective, yep, it will boost energy, which is great. It will improve utilization on the network, which is great. But it's not going to be huge. So what we did, so in this case, we've got no specific allowance for both energy or demand for this year. But, for example, in the distribution space, it might be relevant, so you might actually find out that a particular suburb has more electric vehicles than others. And all of a sudden that suburb has 5 people in the street all driving electric vehicles, they all come home and they all start charging at the same time. Then we might have some challenges at the local network. So conclusions, so that's there's the demand. So as I say, the underlying demand is relatively flat. It's dropped it by about 600 megawatts because of those offsets. Demand side management, storage, energy efficiency. This one here, relatively flat, again pulled down because of energy efficiency and the solar. So that was a whistle-stop tour of a little bit more detail on the making up of the model and some of the assumptions that we've put into the model to provide everybody a common base for the discussions going forward. But is there any particular questions before we? Yep.
Let's bring on from Magnum Energy. Just right back at the start of the presentation, the comparison between 2009 load profile and 2014-15 load profile.
Yep.
And the statement of 1,300 megawatts of solar. On that day, as a guess, how much do you think would be the generation from the solar from PV of the 1,300 megawatts?
Typically, you get about 600 megawatts. So I think you had 1,300 megawatts at time of peak. I think it's worth about 500 to 600 megawatts. Then, as your peak changes and you get later in the day, then it'll then start to reduce. But if you didn't have any solar, we would expect probably another 600 megawatts of peak.
Can I just get you to hold your questions or give you the microphone just so we can make sure we can record it?
Gulzar Semi from Queensland Treasury. Just in the last hours of the day, your solar generation, how much of it, as a percentage of your installed capacity, would you be looking at?
It tails off as you go through the day. So you're looking at maximum solar contribution. Well, it depends where about your solar panels are on your roof, but most are north facing because that maximises there. Really by about 3 o'clock it's starting to roll off. And then you're really looking at very little after about 6 o'clock. You're getting very little contribution, and then obviously when it goes dark, that's it. So.
This is just a comment, Stuart, but I think I was looking at the Fraunhofer Institute data for Germany, and I think they've got close to 40 gigawatts of solar, and in the top period of the year, it sort of maxes out around about 37 gigawatts or so from memory. Similar to wind, you get something like 90%, but it's only going to occur, at one specific time of year. So I think you would surely get close to 90% at least out of your solar panels for at least 1/2 hour of the year when the weather conditions are ideal. Otherwise, you'd have to say that they're not working too well. Wouldn't that be the case?
Yeah, definitely. I've got solar panels myself, and it sits there at about 60% capacity most of the time. I'm willing, come on, generate more. And on a nice clear day, after rain or whatever, then they go up to maximum, and it goes up to maximum and a little bit more, and I think, hey, this is good. But it's getting all of those panels working at the same time. Mine's on the west, so I thought, I'll put them on the west, that's afternoon peak, I'll do the right thing. But others put them on the east, some put them on the north. So when you look at it, there's distributed across Queensland, and yep, some are cloudy here and there. And we've used the data from that Australian PV Institute, and they've got number of solars directly now, so they can, in real time, you can see solar across Queensland, etc. And when you use that data, which is only a sample, so it's not 100%, but it was around about 600 megawatts out of the 1300 that we were getting. So that data may not be quite right, but it wasn't the 1,000.
Yeah, that would be typical sunny conditions possibly.
Mm. And that could be, you might get that, yeah, after it's rained, clear, the sky's nice and clear, but that's not when you're going to get your maximum demand time. So.
Do we have more questions? Yep, one more.
Magnus Heinsberger from AMO. Just briefly a comment first for the presentation in the other room. There was a comparison to AMO's forecast in differences. I should just make sure that you're all aware that we have published a emerging technologies information paper that's providing information about some of these emerging technologies, and does have a little tool as well. I think currently it's only for electric vehicles, but that allows you to play with forecasts for different penetration rates. And then a question. I know we're focusing on emerging technologies, but the question is actually on something simple as the last industrial forecast. What kind of due diligence do you do to the forecast you are receiving from the last Direct Connect customers?
So looking at the Direct Connect customers, and we do a comparison. You can say, well, hang on, well, what did you tell us last year and the year before and the year before? And then if they're indicating a difference, we'll actually sit down with them and say, well, why is that the case, and understand it. That's very good when you're talking to existing Direct Connect customers and you've got that history. One of the challenges you'll have is you may have some new customers coming on. And I reflect back probably 3 or 4 years ago when they were starting in the Surat Basin, they were saying, well, yep, it'll be 1,000 megawatts. Now, in reality, then over the last 5 years, as they've actually then ramped up and whatever else, and then they've got a better understanding of how they're using it, it's actually then dropped from 1,000 down to 800 megawatts. So it's challenging for the, I suppose, Direct Connect customers, particularly the new ones coming, where they're trying to estimate what capacity they require.
In terms of potential industrial closures, is that something you're accounting for?
Not at the moment, so we haven't got that there. But the classic one you're looking at there was Boyne Island. So it'll sit there at 1,000 megawatts. And it's about 18% of the whole of Queensland's energy. So thankfully, Boyne Island, you look at the cost curve of aluminium smelters around the world, it's in one of the more efficient ones. So that's positive. But if, for example, if Boyne closed, we'd have a huge step change in both energy and in the maximum demand. But we haven't got that we haven't factored that into our forecast.
Any more questions before we dive in and you can share your thoughts? Okay.